Hello and welcome to Budget with Business Standard. I am Nivedita Mukherjee. 10 days have passed since the budget and it's still making headlines. This episode will look at some such topics that have remained in news. Tax revenue to green energy and much more. First up is a story on the realistic but conservative tax revenue target. What are the various assumptions behind the estimate? If that's your question too, you have come to the right place. Watch this report.
The Union Budget for 2022-23 has assumed 9.6% growth in gross tax revenue over the 24% increase in FY22. While this may look rather low, even at the 11.1% nominal GDP growth assumption for FY23, the government has factored in a dip in excise duty collections next year due to a reduction in duties on petrol and diesel. So taking out the excise duty, revenue growth comes to 14.2%, which according to Revenue Secretary Tarun Bajaj is a challenging task, especially after a high base of robust tax collections in FY22. Revenue collections also got a leg up in FY22 from around 70,000 crore rupees collected in capital gains tax, with about 20,000 investors entering the equity market every month and excess global liquidity pushing the Sensex to a record high. The Finance Ministry believes the good days are unlikely to be repeated in FY23, and this has been factored in the revenue expectations in the budget. While Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman was praised for the transparency in accounting in last year's budget as she included off-budget borrowings, the repeated failure to achieve the disinvestment target has been a sticking point. For FY23, the Finance Ministry has pegged its revenue estimate for disinvestments much more conservatively at 65,000 crore rupees, despite internal estimates by DIPAM suggesting the government might be able to garner 1.2 trillion next year. But what has spooked the bond market is the whopping 42.9% increase in gross borrowings estimated for FY23. The 10-year bond yields are inching closer to 7% thanks to the 14.95 trillion rupees gross borrowing target for next year. The high borrowing numbers make the rebalancing task of RBI more challenging as it slowly unwinds its accommodative policies. What has caused the government's higher dependence on market borrowings is its anticipation that collections through small savings schemes next year will drop to 4.2 trillion from 5.9 trillion rupees in FY22. The Finance Ministry believes less people will opt for small savings schemes as interest rates of traditional saving instruments go up with the tightening of the monetary policy. That would leave less elbow room for the government to finance its deficit from this head. However, the elephant in the room is the modest assumption for nominal GDP growth next year at 11.1%. Most analysts believe this is rather a conservative estimate. With inflation expected to remain stubborn next year due to rising commodity prices, a higher nominal GDP growth may make the Finance Ministry's job of overshooting the revenue collections target that much easier for one more year.
The debate around whether the revenue estimates are conservative can be looked at from three aspects. The first aspect is the GDP growth itself. Now, the nominal GDP growth has been assumed at 11.1%. Now, given the inflationary trends and the opening up of the economy, the nominal GDP looks to be conservative. The second one is the tax to GDP ratio. Now, the tax to GDP ratio in FY22, as per the revised estimates, has gone up by about 70 basis points. Now, the budget for FY23 has assumed the net tax to GDP ratio to go down by 20 basis points. Now, this seems a little conservative given the digitalization and formalization that we are having in the economy and the buoyancy that we have seen in GST owing to the tax efficiencies and the efficiency of administration. And we should be expecting about 1.4 to 1.5 trillion per month of revenues from GST in FY23. The third aspect is that whether the excise revenues from the excise duty on petroleum products will be realized in FY23 also. It was quite high in FY22. Now, given the oil prices are going to be up and there is a possibility that government may have to further rationalize the excise duty on petroleum products to manage the pump prices of oil. But Given the opening of the economy and the larger consumption and the demand going up for oil and petroleum products, we should not have a much larger shortfall there. Now, given these three aspects, I believe that the revenue estimates are on the conservative side and the government will have the necessary fiscal ammunition from higher revenues to be able to deploy any needs for higher expenditure.
As we saw, the report refers to the modest assumption for nominal GDP growth as the elephant in the room. The proverbial elephant figures in our interview of the day as well. Former RBI Governor C Rangarajan, who was also chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, speaks to Individual Dhasmana on the latest budget. Listen in.
The budget is relying on capex intensive economic growth. How do you view this strategy given that there are competing demands from various other segments of the economy?
The emphasis on increasing capital expenditure is a directional change which is welcome. It has always been argued that we really need to raise the level of capital expenditure and lower the revenue expenditure. As far as the budget for 22-23 is concerned, of the total fiscal deficit, 45.2% of it will now be towards financing capital expenditure. Therefore, from a general point of view, raising the capital expenditure is a good move. Obviously, there are some questions regarding what constitutes capital expenditure, how well the capital expenditures will be incurred. I think these are critical issues associated always with capital expenditure. As you raise, there are competing demands. In the situation in which we are placed, as we are emerging out of the impact of COVID-19, a critical issue that arises is that how do we raise income levels and therefore the consumption expenditure of the people who have been severely affected? It's a very legitimate question, and I think the government must address it. In a sense, the healthcare expenditures went up very substantially, including the expenditures on vaccination last year. Hopefully, the government will maintain the healthcare expenditures and other related expenditures at a level equal to or higher than what it is in the current year. I believe there is some additional fiscal space that is available. The possibility of raising the overall expenditure remains, and therefore, any additional expenditure that may be possible because of the additional revenue collection must go into areas where need for meeting the immediate needs of the vulnerable sections can be met. But at the same time, I do believe that if the growth picks up during the year, some of the bad outcome of the impact of COVID-19 can be taken care of.
You are saying that if growth picks up, budget has assumed nominal growth of 11.1%, which means inflation in the range of 2.6 to 3.1%. How do you see these numbers?
First of all, on the rate of growth of 8 to 8.5% in 22-23, I have my reservations. I think it's a very optimistic estimate. The major reason for this is that if you look at 21-22, in the second half of that year, that is the current year, when there was no base advantage at all, the rate of growth of the economy was only 5.6%. Therefore, going into 2022-23, the expected jump from 5.6% to 8 to 8.5% appears to me to be a big leap and may not necessarily happen. So I would say perhaps a growth rate of 7 to 7.5% may be more realistic. You mentioned about the nominal growth rate of 11.1%. Yes, if you assume a real growth rate of 8 to 8.5%, this clearly implies a very low level of inflation. I don't think that will happen either. Therefore, the inflation level will continue to remain high. I mean, I would say close to 6% is quite possible. As far as the budget is concerned, the critical variable is not so much the real growth as the nominal growth, because tax calculation, expenditure calculations are all related to the nominal rate of growth or the nominal growth of the economy. I would therefore put the nominal growth rate of the economy in 22-23 at somewhere around 13%. This 13% could be a combination of 77.5% real rate of growth and maybe a 5 to 6% inflation.
There are various studies which say that income inequalities in India and other emerging economies have increased due to COVID. So, do you think that in that context, the budget should have imposed a super rich tax or increased surcharge on the highest slab?
There is need to look at our income tax structure. We have several slabs. We have cesses on that, surcharges on that, and so on. I think we really need to get rid of all the cesses and surcharges because they have essentially given a wrong picture about what the level of taxation is. And also, more particularly, the levy of cesses and surcharges deprive the state governments of the share in that revenue. Therefore, I would really suggest that the time has come for the government of India to take a close look at the various slabs and perhaps instead of levying a surcharge, we can introduce another slab even above what we have with a higher level of taxation.
But will it not scare wealth creators?
I know. I mean, this is the conflict always that arises. But one has to strike a balance. And I think after all, in the corporate taxation, some concessions were given 2 years ago. If additional investment is being made, then the corporate tax will come down and the production to start by 2023. That has been extended by 1 more year now. Therefore, some concessions maybe are given in corporate taxation for the purpose of inducing larger investment into the scene. So what we really need to do is to look at the concessions given on one side for generating income. And then once that income is generated, what the level of taxation should be.
A hike in customs duty was announced on a number of products for Atmanirbhar Bharat program. Do you think this is a right strategy or this is an accentuation of protectionist stance?
I think this is a step in the wrong direction. There are occasions on which raising the customs duties or import duties may be warranted, particularly in the case of dumping and so on. And there are specific rules relating to that, and that is what the government should do. But to go on announcing in budget after budget, raising the import duties on commodity X or commodity Y or something is not the right thing. It is almost reminiscent of the budgets before 1991. I think this is not appropriate. I think we should really be able to compete in the market. Our business units and enterprises should be strengthened in order to be able to compete in the market.
And on expenditure side, the government has cut petroleum, fertilizer, and food subsidies. How do you see it? Will it affect the vulnerable sections and the common man and farmers?
Petroleum subsidies, even if they go down, I don't mind. Fertilizer subsidies should be done in such a way that the small farmers are not affected. On food subsidies, I would normally be against reducing it.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Rangarajan. Thanks a lot for talking with us.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Rangarajan believes the budget estimate of economic growth is too optimistic. He also makes the point that cesses and surcharges must go as they give a wrong picture of the level of taxation. On higher customs duties on many items, he says it's not an appropriate process and that it takes us back to the pre-1991 era. Moving on to the next segment, green energy. This report gives us a synopsis of what the budget did for this sector and how the industry has been left asking for more.
There were expectations riding on the Union Budget 2022 to take a green turn as India embarked on the path of being a net carbon zero economy. While Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman did make energy transition a key focus area of her infrastructure development plan, budgetary grants did not reflect that intention. In order to tap the interest of investors in the growing green energy space, the Finance Minister said that sovereign green bonds will be issued for mobilizing resources for green infrastructure. She said the proceeds from the issuance would be deployed in public sector projects that help reduce the carbon intensity of the economy. This buoyed the market to some extent. But in a press conference later, Finance Secretary T.V. Somanathan clarified that green bonds would not be a separate exercise and that these would be part of the government's overall market borrowings in 2022-23. The ministry also did not lay out any significant amount or at least the beneficiary projects or the public sector companies. Making low carbon growth a pivot of development, the budget proposed various near-term and long-term actions in solar power manufacturing, circular economy transition, and transition to a carbon neutral economy. But among these, solar was the only one that received funding. The Finance Minister announced an additional outlay of Rs 19,500 crore for production-linked incentive or PLI scheme for manufacturing of high-efficiency solar photovoltaic modules. India's solar industry is largely dependent on imports, with close to 75% of the country's solar capacity built on Chinese solar equipment. The Indian government has in the past tried to reduce imports and push domestic manufacturing, but it hasn't scaled up to the level of growth of solar power capacity addition. In the first round, concluded in November 2021, 3 companies won the PLI tender for setting up 4 GW of manufacturing each. These were Reliance New Energy Solar, Jindal India Solar Energy, and Shirdi Sai. To accommodate more bids that came in, the government increased the corpus of the solar PLI scheme. Additionally, a basic custom duty of 25% on imported solar cells and 40% on solar module, which is the finished product, would be enforced from April 1. While this has cheered local producers, there is still a risk of solar tariffs going up. Several sectors missed getting budgetary grants or policies, like energy storage, energy efficiency, sustainable business models, energy transition, and phasing down of fossil fuel, among other things. As India prepares for 500 GW of renewable energy in this decade, investment in supporting systems would be of utmost importance, especially energy storage and power transmission. As for the green transition, that seems to be a long road.
The Green Brigade had clearly expected more from the budget. The announcement on sovereign green bonds came as a hope, but the post-budget clarifications disappointed the renewable sector. But surprises, both good and bad, are part of the game in this annual exercise. The Nuggets section today talks about some of the surprises in this budget. Take a look.
As they say, the devil's in the detail. It is often only after reading the fine print, particularly related to the finance bill, that one learns about the crucial changes that lie buried in the documents but are not mentioned directly by the Finance Minister in her budget speech. There were 2 such big surprises in Budget 2022. After coming to power for the first time in 2014, the Modi government had assured companies that there would be no retrospective amendments to laws if they created fresh liabilities. The assurance had come in the wake of the 2012 retrospective amendments to the Income Tax Act with effect from 1962, drawing a lot of criticism. However, in the Finance Bill 2022, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman did propose amending the Income Tax Act retrospectively from April 2005 in order to add the explanation that cess and surcharge are included in the term tax. The explanation was added as Section 40 of the Act prohibits deduction of tax levied on profits of companies while computing the taxable income. Since the section does not mention cess and surcharge, some high courts had ruled in favour of companies that sought to deduct education cess while calculating their taxable income. Later, in her post-budget interaction at industry body FICCI, Sitharaman explained the rationale of this retro amendment. She said that not doing it retrospectively would have become an issue in execution and that it would have been unfair to two sets of taxpayers. The second surprise was the proposed insertion of a new section in the Customs Act through the Finance Bill 2022 to make the publication of any information related to exports and imports a punishable offence. This includes details of exporters and importers. The new section 135AA will not apply to a person or entity who is required to publish such information by law or if it is done by the sovereign. The purpose of the proposed provision is to prevent details of imports and exports as may be captured by the IT system of Customs Department or by NIDB data from being leaked out.
In this budget, there's nothing quite close to the retrospective tax shocker introduced in 2012. But any surprise will be a talking point for some time. That's all we have for you today. See you on Saturday with a special episode. Do watch.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.